Welcome to Cattle Call, an original production of the Nebraska Rural Radio Association. I'm Chad Moyer. Cattle Call is brought to you by Wolf Auto, small town strong. Their website, wolfauto.com. Check out their inventory and all of their services available there. Thanks to Wolf Auto for sponsoring Cattle Call again this week. Of course, it's Brad Kooima and Varilek there at Sioux Center, Iowa, as we break down what's going on in the cattle markets. We've had a few headlines here over the last few weeks. We kind of trudged our way through those. Looks like we do have a new one here to talk about here today. But first of all, just a kind of a quick recap. Thanksgiving last week, delayed trade in the South. What do you make of where cash trade ended last week? Early in the North, late in the South. Kind of feels like limited volume, but what's your takeaway?
Chad, thanks for having me on. I think it's a great place to start. We didn't even really prep for this, but that reminds me of something that maybe is worth talking to because I thought it was a bit interesting. LMR, excuse me, the marketing, livestock marketing that everybody thinks is such a great idea. It started in the 90s before cell phones and everything else. The idea being that we need transparency and so we need to report all these trades. Well, I'd say that ship is set and sailed. I think people know what cattle are worth anymore, but there are some stipulations with whether there's a reporting deal or not. For instance, Colorado hasn't reported cash cattle for my memory for years because there isn't enough cattle. Texas had that last week for the first time that I can remember, maybe a number of years ago. Remember they had that big snowstorm or ice storm? There might have been 2-3 days there where that complicated, but there was literally not enough cattle, cash cattle traded in Texas to quote a market. How's that? Failed for confidentiality. So yeah, to your point, it was very limited trade, very light trade. And you almost had to, know somebody that was trading a few cattle, which, most of us in this business do after this long. So the light trade that did develop late in the South was around 220, which was higher. And at that time was quite a bit higher than where futures were, although the futures have caught up pretty nicely now. The North, limited volume in the beginning of the week and really slow at the end of the week. There was a little tiny bit of 215 Chad. And on most kind of cattle, they were a long haul type cattle too. We're going all the way south to get dead. So the dynamic here of there's cattle in the North, overburdensome, probably not. Some big cattle in the North, but the shortage, the tightness is the South. And even though our cattle are much superior in quality, we're going to get a little less for them because they don't have enough to go around down there at all.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on the currentness of the cattle trade? And I'm going to ask it based on with this for context. I've been reading some where they've said some analysts have said the Packers have some cattle purchased ahead around them. When I look at the far out numbers, I guess I don't agree with that. And I don't have an economics degree. I'm just a guy who talks on the radio every day, but it feels like I don't know if I agree with that argument. Do you agree or disagree with that?
Chad, don't sell yourself short. I think you got a better understanding than most people that I interview with. So good for you. There's a couple of ways to look at that. I think sometimes I tend to be a little, first of all, I think people that get interviewed like myself, and sometimes I get done with these and I think, there I am trying to sound like an expert and I don't know. Why was it sharply higher yesterday? I don't have a great explanation. So, if I give off the impression that I'm some sort of an expert, I apologize. I'm old, got that going for me. Good at parallel parking too. That's the only other skill I've really got. You can measure it with an objective look at it. And I guess what I'm saying is, how are the average weights? Record high. You can measure it by looking at how the cattle are grading. And that's even a little bit subjective because and the cattle are all the time. We've never had this much percentage of prime. Now, is that because of camera grading? Is that because we aren't feeding hardly any, if at all, Mexican cross cattle that don't grade, no matter how long you feed them? Probably. Is it because of the increase of beef on dairy, which would grade better than that Mexican stuff that they would have fed in Texas? In other words, probably. So some of that dynamic is all in there. And so that's some of the objective attempt at it. So based on that, you'd say we probably aren't as current as we might be. But think about it. I mean, we've got a lot less cattle. The packer has encouraged us all year long to get them a little bigger because he's trying to get tonnage, right? But I do think that there's a regional imbalance in the currentness, and I'll give you my subjective opinion on that. I think in the north we're not so hot. Can we clean it up in a couple of weeks? Yeah, but here in the north, I heard the refrain over and over of, well, the feeder cattle are too high, I'm going to feed what I got. And that's what he did. And the weather's been, up until this last snowstorm here, the weather's been so good that these cattle have really performed, which also lends to bigger weights. I don't think that the south, on the other hand, I think the currentness level there is fine. And it's because the raw supply has forced the issue. Now, in terms of whether packer has cattle around him or has inventory, or there is an objective way to look at that a little bit, because you do get reporting from the USDA on the number of contracts and stuff like that, and there's a lot of them for December. Okay, and so maybe that has taken the edge off of the buy in terms of the negotiated buy. That nobody's ever going to convince me that it doesn't make a difference, that the more negotiation that's done, that doesn't impact price. No one is going to ever argue me out of that concept. So there's a bit of that. But then if you go past that next period, that first quarter, there's very, very few cattle contract. And I think some of the problem is because the break evens are so stinking high back there, Chad, that you never had a chance to, so it's going to be an interesting thing to see once, if the need to have increase in negotiation, if that's going to help push us along a little bit. The lack of the packer having inventory control, captive supply, whatever phrase you like the best. That'll be an interesting dynamic. I'd like to see us a hair more current than we are, but we need to get busy and fix that. And it's the guys in the north here up here where we are, that would need to fix that.
Okay. We mentioned the headlines. We did have a new headline here middle of this week, and a new World Screwworm case within 120 miles of the U.S. border. We haven't had one of those announcements in a while. Did the market take notice of that, Brad?
I think that was part of the rally yesterday, and part of it the early part of the day today. We're still higher as we record this, but not nearly like it was early. I don't know about you, Chad, but I am about tired of hearing about about every 6 weeks or so, if the market needs a little bullish recharge, we can throw that out there. It was one steer on a load from almost on the southern border of Mexico. They have not exactly said likely that larva was dead, because usually those cattle get treated with Ivermectin when they get traveled that far. So I don't know. Late comments last week, everybody's making a big deal out of Rollins's interview that she had done. And made it sound like it was going to be later rather than sooner again on the border opening. I don't know. I'd like to give you some kind of good substantive comment on it. The border's been closed for just about coming up on a year now. Is it bullish every time they find another one down there? I can't see why it is. I really think it's more ultimately, when are we going to reopen? And even then, folks, it's going to be slow. I don't think it's going to be this overwhelming cascade of 1,200-pound cattle. So, I would say trade accordingly. But to me, the more deferred, it would have more bearish risk than the upfront, just because of the nature of a slow opening.
All right. Let's get to our listener question part. I posed this to you before we went on the air here. And this was a comment. I assume this person is from further north and not sure which sector. Again, I'm going to guess maybe cow-calf, but the comment was, no grazing for cattle up north over the winter months. Don't want to pay for hay, so better sell. Not necessarily a question, but it is a statement. And again, it kind of got my brain whirling based on the dynamics that we have, the value of the cattle today versus the value of what you can buy hay for. Do you agree with this statement or not? You want to try and unpack that?
I'll give it my best shot, and I don't mean to be rude, because I may not be interpreting the question or the comment, at least in the the way it's been said, but 900-pound steers yesterday at a sale barn ranked 340. I know what hay costs. It's not that much. If it's a matter of convenience, which I get it, it's winter. We've got 8 inches of snow on the ground. I suppose but I'm not getting that from most producers. In fact, I'm getting the exact opposite from most producers, whether you're talking about a 5-weight calf or a 1,500-pound steer. And that is that I can cheaper feed what I got than to look at doing anything in terms of replacement because of the overall value of what these cattle are bringing per pound. It doesn't cost that much to put a pound of gain on, to make it real simple. I think anybody that feeds would understand that. Now, I'm trying to understand a little bit more of exactly what this comment is about, and I actually think that that in some cases this fed cattle or this feeder cattle, replacement type cattle, I think some guys are actually ahead of schedule because they love the price. That you got a rancher out there that's going like, I've never heard this much for a 600-pound steer calf. I'm not going to wean it and dink around until January. I'm going to sell it because somebody's crazy enough to give me $4.10 for a 6-weight. So I don't know. To each his own. There's probably some dynamic there that I'm not understanding, but I think people are incentivized by price, and so I guess that's how it looks to me. I'd be curious to see how many calves are out there to see after the first of the year. Typically, there's a big run of those wean calves. I'm wondering how many of them will be left.
Yeah. Well, and you bring up a good point because it's more than just the cost of what you're going to sell it versus the cost to buy the hay. Because you've got the labor, you've got it costs more to feed in the winter because it's colder. They're using more energy. I get that, but it's an interesting conversation.
Absolutely, fun to talk about.
Before we let you go, kind of a preview for the rest of the week. Here we are at midweek. I haven't seen a whole lot of trade. I guess what are kind of the keys? What are you going to be looking at here through the rest of the week?
Well, they're going to be asking higher, Chad. I lean toward thinking that we'll get a little bit better. Auction stuff this week, if it's representative, that sure look firmer. Some of these fat cattle auctions, things that I'm looking for, I'm getting a little bit of it, and that is a little bit of an interest in increasing the kill. And a couple of, I know one at least that's been killing 4 days a week is going 5 days this week for the first time in a couple of months. One of the things that hopefully this is a short-term problem, but I'm not crazy about the way the box beef is acting here. We need that box beef to kick in gear here like it usually does by the second week of December. That's next week, the first full week anyway. I think it will, but it feels a little sloppy right now. So that would also, obviously incentivize the packer to gear up his kill too. Obviously Lexington is something that we beat to death here the last couple of times we've talked. But ultimately, as we move into January, somebody else is going to have to pick up the slack here and kill a few more cattle. And hopefully that is because they're making some money, and that should help. So let's clean up a little bit of the cattle. I think we'll be a little bit better on the cash. Unfortunately, the North will probably lag behind the South because of the supplies up here. And then hopefully we move higher into the back end of December.
All right, very good. Folks that would like to reach out certainly can do that by website or by the phone call, right?
Absolutely. We'd rather have you call. You can sure look us up at kkvtrading.com, but 712-722-0023. Talk to me or any of the other 3 brokers we have.
Very good. Appreciate the insights. Thank you, as always. Good job, Brad. That's Brad Kooima and Varilek at Sioux Center, Iowa, on today's Cattle Call. Again, Cattle Call is brought to you by Wolf Auto, small town strong. Have a great week. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. That'll let you know when another Cattle Call is available. And put your questions and comments and thoughts down in there and give us something to chew on next week's Cattle Call. Have a great week. We'll see you next week on Cattle Call.